Hey guys, Captain C.A here from Backlashes YouTube. I want to talk to you today a little bit about backlashes, or better, the lack of backlashes that you will experience if you start test driving the Curado DC from Shimano. That's right, they put this in my hands last spring. I got to use it through the entire sea trout season out in Louisiana, catching big redfish. And then this fall and winter, we used it for everything from flounder to snook. So I want to share with you some of the results and how I believe a lot of you that have, resisted the temptation anymore from going to casting gear because you think your spinning gear is bulletproof. Well, I'm going to give you a reason why to jump back in. Stay tuned. This episode of Backlashes YouTube is brought to you by Aquatraction, your go-to solution for advanced marine flooring. All right, let's talk a little bit about the philosophy of bait casting. You're probably saying, well, I've tried bait casting and I suck at it. I backlash all the time. I don't want to put myself through it. And why should I? Because I'm pretty good with my spinning gear. And then there's a contingent of you that will say, well, I use both now. I throw the heavier stuff with my bait casting gear and I throw the lighter stuff with my spinning gear. Well, I'm here to convince you that you can throw everything on your casting gear. You really can. And why would you do that? Well, there's a couple of drawbacks with spinning gear. There's line twist and wind knots, and the fact that you typically use longer rod lengths to accomplish the same thing. And in many cases, the reels are heavier than the low profile casting reels unless you spend enough money to get the super light bodies that you can buy at Shimano and spend that little bit of extra dough, and then you can lighten that stuff up quite a bit. But let's just say you're trying to keep at a price point of rod and reel under $350. Well, that is why I teach in classes, if you want to spend a lot of money on the reel, buy a casting reel. If you want to spend a lot of money on a rod, that's when it kind of makes sense to spend it more on the spinning side. Because when you're fishing a spinning reel, it's the rod that generates the energy and pulls the line off the reel. The reel, you're paying for the corrosion resistance and you're paying for the carbon max drag. You're paying for all the stuff that makes that reel balanced. In casting gear, you need a sophisticated, advanced reel that will allow the freedom for you to make those long casts, be corrosion resistant, be light, and just give you all the casting advantages you'd have with a spinning reel, but in a casting reel. So there's this at odds thing all the time. Now, I'm not gonna bullshit you. I personally like to use stuff that costs $500. That's what I like to use, because just like a professional golfer, you want to be able to use the best stuff because guys at my level can get the most out of it. So why not spend the money? But if you're on a budget, you're a college kid, you're someone that is out there fighting the good fight week after week, and you only have the weekends and you can't justify spending that, you need to spend the money on an outfit, I think, that will give you the most advantages. And with casting gear, and that's what we're only going to talk about today, that would have to be this Curado DC. This is the 150 size. It does a lot for you for the money. Now, this costs $249, but I'm going to share with you a rod in the shop that cost about $90 that you can mate these two together, and you can do about anything you want in inshore salt water. flounder, speckled trout, redfish, snook. You can do all those things. And you can throw the lures that you typically would throw on your spinning rod. That's right. So those of you that are in the group that say, well, I throw both casting and spinning. Well, so do I. But your casting is probably limited to these bigger topwaters, like the Top Dog Junior, probably weighs 3/4, 7/8 of an ounce, or the 27 MR or the 37 MR, the bigger suspending twitch baits. That's what you're throwing on there because you can put them on medium heavy gear or even heavy gear, swing them with 40-pound braid, and if you have any sense of thumb control and the tension knob, you probably rarely backlash, and you can throw through the wind, across the wind, and whatnot. The trick is throwing all the baits that you throw 70% of the time, because you're only throwing that heavy stuff 15% of the time. You're throwing the real tiny stuff 15% of the time, like the Ned stuff, which throws well on spinning gear. But all that stuff in the middle, that 1/4 to 1/2 ounce range, you're like, well, you know, I backlash a lot if I throw that. And I'm talking about spoons. I'm talking about MR17s, the original Myrdine size. I'm talking about bucktail jigs. I'm talking about swim baits, lead heads and tails that go 1/4, 3/8. I'm even talking about bulkier baits that'll definitely make you backlash, like the Little Devil from Paul Brown, or a Catch 2000 here that I have rigged up with inlines. If you want to throw that in, especially these guys here, keel weighted jerk sheds, that's certainly a way to backlash, especially throwing into the wind because you got a big bait kind of knuckleballing into the wind. How do you beat that? This reel, when you balance it with the right rod, will beat it. And I'm going to show you that next. Now, I'm going to send you to the water where I was fishing with one of my best buds, Captain Brian Chamberlain, and show you a little bit of snook fishing. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go in the next room and show you what I mean by rod reel balance.
Mine hit a mullet. It might be a snook. Oh yeah, it is a snook. Oh yeah.
I'm hoping that incoming water will make them turn on.
Right here on the turn. The jig. Jig always fools them. Snook. It does. It makes you wonder why we use anything else some days. All right, I'm gonna get a quick picture of him with my other camera.
Sure.
Great video. And an unbelievable trip, as always, with Captain Brian Chamberlain. The guy's amazing, whether he's pushing you around on the flats or he's got you on one of the back bays that he fishes all the time. He always puts you on fish. That's a fact. All right, well, that video gave away the rod that we were going to talk about, which is the GLF from Shimano. Very affordable rod. We're talking under $90. This is their Gulf Inshore Series rod. It's very parabolic. You can get the medium heavy action, but all the actions have a lot of give to them, which make them perfect for redfish and trout. But as you can see, we catch snook on them as well. Now, I've chosen this particular rod for this bait casting deal for one simple reason. When you're throwing that category or that weight category from 1/4 to 1/2 ounce, if you're throwing that on medium heavy or something that's medium heavy extra fast, which is toward the heavy side, you have to generate a lot of tip speed in the rod to kick that bait out there. And if it's only a 1/4 ounce spoon, there's a good chance that you're going to have to get so much spool speed going, you're going to backlash the reel. The nice thing about understanding the lure balance, the rod and reel balance, is that when you put it all together like I have with this 3/16 jig head, 4-inch tail, 20-pound braid, you can make casts that are nice and smooth, still get the adequate casting distance that you want, and never backlash, because this rod is a little slower. So what it does is when I come back, it stores the energy. And then when I drive it forward smoothly, it unloads the energy without increasing the spool speed. Now, I took one of these out of the box so I could show you how simple this is. Now, when Shimano first sent it to me, it made this noise. And I was like, what the heck? It sounds like my rocking chair rolled over the top of the cat. It was like, whee! And I was like, what? So I didn't know that that's the signature sound. That is that digital brake, the DC, slowing that spool down to keep you from backcasting or keep me. So I was like, cool. So then I opened it up and I started looking inside. There's no brakes for me to adjust, none. There's 4 settings on this. 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's it. 1 offers the least resistance. And I use that quite a bit, especially if I'm throwing 30 or 40 pound braid on something like this. So if I've got something set up like that, 30 or 40 pound braid, and I might be throwing bigger plugs, I throw it on 1. Whoo! Kick it out there. If I'm throwing the stuff that's 3/8 to 1/2 ounce, and I'm throwing it on 20 pound braid, I'm throwing it on number 2, and that's what it's set for right now, number 2. That's what I like to throw this Corrado DC 150 HG most of the time. 20 pound braid and throw it on number 2. The third setting is when it's a little windier, especially if it's windier. I'm definitely throwing the Mirrodine or a 1/4 ounce spoon or a 1/4 ounce jig head with a tail. I'm throwing it on 3 if I'm driving it into the wind. Now they have a 4 setting, which is the most resistant. And if I move it over to that, let's move it back that way. If I set it all the way to 4, which is the last setting, right there. Okay, I don't know if the camera can focus that close, but when you set it on 4, typically, I again put a little bit heavier braid on this, and I put it on a heavier action rod, and I skip. So if I want to skip mangroves, docks, yes, you can skip with a bait casting reel. It's possible. Do it all the time. In fact, sometimes much better than you can on a spinning reel. And all it requires is a heavier bait, heavier line, and a lockdown setting like number 4. And you swing that on a heavy action rod and you'll be able to skip way back in there. You just have to be quick to the reel and swim it back out. So it gives you some deep, deep penetration. Boy, that could haunt me on skipping baits. So this is an excellent reel to accomplish a lot of different things. Now, if you're a beginner, I would take this out of the box, I would put 30 on it, and I would probably start casting it on 4 right away. After about a day of getting used to that, because it's hard to backlash on 4. It's really hard to backlash, especially if you set the tension knob so that the spool won't knock at all. Like, it's knocking right there. But if I set it tight enough where it stops the knock, right at the point where it stops the knock and it's on 4, you can cast. You just can't cast as far, but you'll be able to cast trouble-free. I encourage you, after you do that for a little bit, then go to number 3. And before you know it, you'll be at number 2, but you'll have to use a little bit more thumb. Now, you can backlash this reel. You can backlash it. Don't let you think for a second that you can't. You will backlash it. But it will greatly, I mean greatly, reduce the opportunity to backlash. I promise you. Now, I want to finish up back inside at my desk in there. And while I'm walking this equipment back in there, I want you to go back to the water with Captain Brian and I. We're going to catch a redfish this time.
This one is a red. Man, he wanted to pull hard.
One little hole the size of a pickup truck.
Yeah.
Leaves the world.
It does the way the water comes in. Yep. Brings food to them. Oh, buddy. They're all pulling hard now. That fresh incoming tide.
Mm-hmm.
just big enough to make me get down. Just big enough.
That's probably the one that his little brother stole it.
Probably was. Probably went right into that zone. Ooh. Trout eye jig head. That's a strong hook. Off he goes.
Well, we're back. Brian put us on another trophy-sized fish. That's his MO. If you've watched enough Flats Class YouTube, you know that Brian is a regular on here, pushing me around and allowing me to teach you guys how to be better anglers. Before we go any farther, I'm not trying to get you not to use spinning gear. You just gotta think. I've been doing this for 35 years, literally doing it. I mean, at a level that's kind of high, all right? So when I grew up, the only spinning gear that I got to use on a regular basis was like Cardinal reels, Mitchell 300s, Penn 308s. Stuff for the time seemed pretty impressive. Even the Daiwa Whisker series, from the late 80s, early 90s. But that's not what we have today. Stuff today, the technology is way past that. But that's why I grew up throwing stuff like this. These old Ambassador C3s, and this is the C40, the 4600 C4. This is the stuff that I was throwing. And I had an advantage over some of that spinning gear back then. Remember, I was fishing when there wasn't braid. I mean, there was Dacron, but there wasn't even braid back in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s. We didn't have that stuff. We were still using mono all the time. So this was superior. I didn't have fishing shows like you guys have or YouTube channels. I'm watching the American Sportsman. I'm watching, mostly bass guys like Roland Martin and Hank Parker Jr. and Bill Dance and Rick Clunn and Bob Cobb on Bassmaster. So those were the influences that got me throwing this stuff. Now I've come a long way from this to this DC. That's a long way. You got to spend the dough on this reel because if you're getting introduced into bait casting, I think it's going to make your learning curve a heck of a lot faster. That's a fact. It's just a fact. It's going to make you better, quicker, for sure. You can save the money on the rod. And honest to goodness, that Shimano GLF Inshore Series rod is awesome for the money. It's built for salt water. It's built for the marine environment. And the actions are perfect for trout and redfish, even though there's more you can do with it, but they're perfect for it. You don't have to spend a lot. Like I said earlier in this episode, when you're spending money on a rod, if you're a pro seasoned guy that's used to throwing it, you can spend the money and it's worth it because you get the most out of it. But in casting gear, it makes sense to spend the money on the reel. And in spinning gear, it makes sense to spend the money on the rod because the rod is the thing that gets it out there. Where the line shoots off the casting reel, it gets pulled off the spinning reel. That's a fact. I hope you enjoyed this little lesson. I've really fallen in love with this reel. It's worked out good for me. And as much as the 200 Corrado, which I've got 200 Corrados in there that are from way back, and it has always been my workhorse, my ox, the thing I do most of my fishing with. It's corrosion resistant for the marine environment. It's got a wide spool, lots of line capacity, a great drag system. Never fails me, and I can bomb cast with that Corrado 200. I love the 200 XG in particular. But since I've been throwing this, I got to admit the adjustment that you need to make is very minimal. You can throw into the wind, you can skip, you can throw lighter lures, you can throw heavier lures, and it really doesn't matter what rod you're using most of the time. Now, of course, because I've been preaching to you, I pair this up with a Terramar XX, But you can get away with a GLF inshore series and do almost as well. You just have to slow your casting motion down a little bit. And you'll be casting like Shaw Grigsby in no time. I promise you. All right, if you like what you're seeing here at Flats Class YouTube, come on, give us a thumbs up and tell your fishing buddies. We want you guys to subscribe. It's my job to make you a better fisherman. That's what I do. And join us every Monday night. On Monday nights on Instagram Live, we have basically a fishing club or a fishing class. Start showing up on Monday nights on Instagram Live for Flats Class, and I promise you, you're going to learn something every week. If you want to get any of this gear, minus the antique crap, go to sodiumusa.com. That's where I buy everything. Until next time, Captain C.A. Richardson, signing off.